1 hour, one continent, one voice. Africa World Hour with Tsepiso Makwetla on Channel Africa, the African perspective.
The African perspective indeed continues here on Africa World Hour, rounding up some of the top stories and, of course, bringing to you stories that not only increase our knowledge, that are of interest, but, of course, where we bring you different perspectives. And this time we look at a bold and very necessary conversation. What if the economy was built to care for us, not control us? This is a question that Oxfam South Africa and the New Economy Hub are asking at their upcoming event Beyond GDP, measuring what matters in an inclusive economy. And at the center of this conversation is our guest today, Dr. Lebohang Pheko, activist, scholar, and longtime advocate for feminist economics and decolonial development. Dr. Pheko, a very good evening to you. Warm welcome to Africa World Hour.
Thank you so much, Ms. Makwetla.
So let's talk about this conversation. It's framed around radical but very simple question. What if the economy was built to care for us or control us? How do you interpret the challenges in the African context today, and what it would eventually look like if we were to achieve that goal?
So I think the one thing is we have inherited or chosen to be beholden to neoliberal economic frameworks, including the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. And we've also chosen to then use measures that are not necessarily designed to measure the things that are important to us. So the gross domestic produce is one kind of measure, which normally is really the sum total of a few indicators, but has become this proxy for progress, growth, and development, even though, of course, it was designed to rebuild the European and US economies after the Second World War. And of course, it's now become externalized and internationalized as the thing that everybody pursues. And I think if we were thinking a bit differently around what progress looks like and around what development looks like, we would definitely have very different conversations about what is valuable. So the use of time and the interpretation of time, the definition of work. So including the ways in which we have chosen to interpret productivity in a very narrow way in terms of 9-to-5 jobs. And yet we understand that there are people who work in parallel economies. They work in social reproduction. They do different kinds of care for the community, different kinds of care for the planet, and different kinds of care even for the next generation. We'd understand that we cannot only measure growth on the basis of GDP when there's jobless growth at the same time, when there's a growth in unemployment, when there's a growth in poverty, and when there's also an increase in a growth there's a growth in the poverty of social relations. So many different alternative indices use things like voluntary work as a measure of productivity, use things like relationality, our relationality, sense of neighborliness, the ability to feel safe in our own communities, a sense of having love, a sense of having, a faith-based community, different things which possibly wouldn't show up in our conventional measures. But when we think about who we are, especially as African people, they measure up and they're perfectly aligned to who we are.
So you've given us examples of the various indicators that could be used to reflect a caring African society. Are there examples on the continent that have done this exactly? Rwanda's community healthcare workers, I know that's something of a project that Rwanda is very proud of and invests a lot in. In the South African context, what would it be? Are there other Western countries that we could adopt what would essentially be, in the African context, a well-being economic indicator?
So we already have a few, Ms. Makwetla. We have the Multidimensional Poverty Index, the MPI, which Statistics South Africa has used to great effect. And this measures different things. It measures different kinds of deprivation in the areas of health, education, living standards. And it actually shows at the moment that about 1 billion people globally are living in acute multidimensional poverty. We also have, for example, the Living Poverty Prosperity Index, which was devised by the Afrobarometer. And this also speaks around a scarcity index, and it tracks day-to-day deprivation. So we know that the dollar a day, or I think it's $2 a day index, has never been adequate because it only measures it measures everything that a person income that they are able to accrue in a day. That includes through begging, that includes through scavenging, that includes through finding the things that they find. And then that is hardly measuring a dignified and decent, income at all. So we also have, for example, and South Africa, by the way, has also done pioneering work on well-being economics. I think in 2012, there was an important study that was conducted, which set up aside I think about 12 different indicators, including education and health. Unfortunately, it went nowhere. And then lastly, we can also look at countries like Thailand, which talk about things like the sufficiency economy philosophy, which I really love because it really speaks around developing a national development campus, and it also speaks, in a very deeply ethical way. So they base that in Buddhist principles, but we have a lot of anchoring. We talk about Boto, so forth. And then if you also think around Bolivia, where they talk about buen vivir, meaning a good life, and how rich that could potentially be if we interpret for ourselves what a good life is. Not a good life for a few people who live in mansions, but a good life for the majority of people, for the most dispossessed, and for those who have been the most adrift in the last 30 years.
I think you mentioned the capitalist aspects of the types of economies that we live in, and often the production levels are then measured differently. So if we're talking about young people and the high levels of unemployment that we're seeing not only across the region but in South Africa as well, what would we be reimagining in terms of bringing them in, but also I'm thinking allowing them to infuse their own way of thinking of what they believe a care economy would be and what their contribution could be?
Yeah, that's really exciting. That's actually an exciting question because it's, I think when we think about young people, there's the myth that's been sold to them about the gig economy, about being their own boss, and this Uberization of work, and which we understand now to be incredibly precarious and to be actually be a way that the state has managed to step back and excuse themselves and recuse themselves from actually doing the things that need to be done for workers, including providing pensions, basic protections, basic labor rights, the basics of what it means to be a worker that is nurtured, and instead has built up this myth around precarity, pretending that everybody can be a Bill Gates or a Mark Zuckerberg, which are not really great role models for all kinds of reasons. So I think really what we need to be thinking about are home-based support, agroecology, and building different forms of work so that there is, and different forms of economics which are built around solidarity, that are built around redistribution, and that are also built around transferable skills. That's what's really important. But this also means that we have to have portable benefits for platform workers and for people whose work has been informalized and doesn't really meet the mainstream definitions of what work is in terms of a 9 to 5 kind of gig. And bearing in mind, Ms. Makwetla, that 60 to 80% of people on this continent actually work in what is called, in the parallel economy. Some people will call it the informal economy. I think that's a problematic term, but actually work in the parallel economy. We have to think much more creatively and much more imaginatively about how then to our policy frameworks and our regulatory framework catch up with the realities on the ground.
I was just speaking to somebody from the WHO Afro office, who's the climate leader there, and we're speaking about the exceedingly high heat levels that we're seeing. And I was saying to him that some unions are already saying, depending on the country context, that labor laws need to change against workers working in these dangerously high heat conditions. What policy shifts need to be made in order to be in step with the current unknowns of the times that we're facing?
So, I mean, I think a few would be to think around what a well-being budget would look like. So we already have gendered responsive budgeting, which unfortunately, as South Africa, we haven't been as robust about, even though we are globally the leaders, one of the founding nations in this regard. And that would mean replacing GDP only targets with this multi-dimensional poverty index that I mentioned, adding the Agenda 2063 dashboards into our national and municipal budgeting. That's one very strong possibility. Another would be to rethink the national care accounts and time use surveys. Now, time is a really important part of reimagining and reintegrating our constructs around productivity and our constructs around work. And it also links very closely to our pay conditions and the kind of reforms that need to happen for us to benchmark against ourselves, the best of ourselves, not some abstract world out there. And I think another piece of this, Ms. Makwetla, is to think around social protection floors. We have to rethink the notion of social wages and remove it from the purview of being seen as some sort of a stigma of people who are either too lazy to work, or who are only in the common franca, they're just having babies so that they can get a grant. I mean, those are just shocking characterizations and really obfuscate very complex intergenerational poverty, the desperation of many communities, and the fact that we have we have issues with child-headed families, with single-headed families, and so forth because of our history. So we really need to rethink ways in which we reignite the social contract, because that's really what a social wage is. It is a social contract to enable everybody in any particular community to live a dignified life while they are trying to transition from one income level or lack of income to the next. The money that enables folks to get to interviews, get their taxi fares to get to where they need to, buy a tie, print the CV, and all of this. But basically, all of these things are also to do with how we then rethink the notion of how we are in community with each other.
And I'd imagine the role of society would be to choose government who would be able to build a capable state for that, or at least hold accountable the leaders that are in place to do that. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Dr. Pheko, Dr. Lebohang Pheko, speaking to us about their conversation that is happening this Sunday. So don't miss it. It's on the 24th of August at Breeze Block in Johannesburg. Oxfam South Africa and the New Economy Hub will host that discussion led by Dr. Lebohang Pheko. And you heard the question that is being asked, what does a caring economy look like, and what if we had an economy that was built to care for us and not to control us? That brings us to 14 minutes to 10.